Hi, welcome to the workshop. Right, well this is a very big day. Last time we managed to get John's rotten old Range Rover to actually start, which was quite a moment. So the next obvious question is, does it actually drive? Now, John's memory of his Range Rover is rather rose-tinted to say the least, and apparently it drove into the garden. Well, whether it did or not, it's been standing there for a very long time before this very moment. So, if it does drive, I will honour my promise of actually getting it out of the workshop, giving it a thoroughly good clean before we take it down to the MOT to get a thoroughly big spanking, no doubt, with a massive list of failures and advisories. But first things first, let's get it out of the workshop. That does sound good. Now, this is a moment that many of you have been longing for. It's also a moment that many of you have been very concerned about. First of all, why hasn't it happened already? Also, there is so much vegetation on this vehicle, if I clean it all off, then it's no longer going to be carbon neutral. There are so many cobwebs on this vehicle that once they're gone, there'll be nothing holding the car together. In fact, there is so much rust that once that's actually fizzing away as we're washing it off, the car might actually dissolve completely, which might not be a bad thing actually thinking about it. Also, the fact that the doors don't shut also means that the interior is certainly going to get a wash, but that's no bad thing either. There's no getting away from it. This is going to happen. It's wash day for our Range Rover, and for that, I'm going to need some equipment. I need something a bit more sporty than that. That's more like it. But this car has got all kinds of things growing in it, so it's going to be quite toxic, so I need some proper protection. Right, let's do this. Now, John has said that he's called this car Daisy. Well, I'd like to give him a counter name, perhaps. It's silver, it's covered in moss, or at least it was. Maybe we should call it Sterling. Or perhaps Rusty. Even more of John's vintage filth. He's a dirty, dirty boy. Right, time to get deep into that grotty undercarriage. Well, that is looking so much better. It almost looks respectable. One last bit and we're ready for the MOT. Right, well now those of you that are keen-eyed will have noticed this is not an MOT station, and in fact the Range Rover is still very much stuck in the workshop. Well, it came to the point where I actually got to drive away, popped it into drive, and it kind of lurched into gear, which is not really a good sign. I thought, okay, I'll leave that, I'll keep going, see what happens, and eventually drive vanished altogether. Now, I've had a quick chat with John, and it turns out he does have a sort of vague recollection that perhaps the gearbox might have had an issue the last time he used it. Now that was 12 years ago. It could be a catastrophic problem, or equally it could be the fact that there was a little minor issue, and then since then the hygroscopic fluid, the transmission fluid, that actually has been absorbing water for all of those years. Now obviously water has very different properties to the oil that should be in the gearbox, which is we explain why it wouldn't necessarily work properly. So I'm going to try a little trick, just in case it gets us to the MOT station sooner rather than later. I'm going to drop out the oil while it's still a little bit warm, and I'm going to replace it with some brand new oil, put in a new filter, and just maybe that'll just give us a little bit more miles before we have to actually deal with the gearbox properly. But the other issue is once I was going, I then had to stop. And unfortunately, the pedal went pretty much straight to the floor, as you'd expect. I know the condition of the brakes is pretty poor, but I wasn't expecting to see any leaks just yet. Now, obviously, I've just topped up that fluid there, and you can see that the rear of the reservoir is actually still full of fluid. It's only the front that's now quite depleted, and obviously only just filled that up. So the issue must be that we have a leak. Now I noticed there was a little bit of a sort of a trail left by the car on the driver's side, so it looks like it's going to be the front driver's side wheel that's going to need attention. So I'll drop the fluid first from the gearbox, and then I'll start looking at the brakes, and hopefully we will get to the MOT station today, maybe. Right, so back under the car, there is our engine, there is the bell housing of our automatic transmission, and there is the oil pan or the sump, and then of course you've got your little drain plug down there. But obviously to get to this, to actually take this off so I can get to the filter, which is actually inside the gearbox, I'm going to need to remove this cross member. Now thankfully it's bolted in, but of course those bolts have been there rusting for many, many years. And once it's removed, I suspect the chassis is going to kind of slightly move, making it harder to get back in. But the first thing I need to do is just start draining the old oil out because of course that can take a bit of time just to finish dripping while I'm undoing everything else. Okay, so, and with any luck, first of all this will actually undo, and then hopefully the fluid will mostly go in the container. Oh dear, look at the state of that. Well, that isn't ideal. Now this should be a nice bright pink colour. The fact that it's kind of this milky brown means that it's not only burnt, but also it's full of water. And now, having spun it up, I've now emulsified the whole thing. So this is definitely the right thing to do to drop this out. I might leave that draining for a while. Wow, I cannot believe the state of that transmission fluid. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and thank you for all your comments and questions. Please do keep them coming. Now, I've had a couple of comments about a slight squiffiness of the subtitles in some languages. Now, obviously, Mrs. C slaves away, tapping away, trying to convert my gobbledygook into actual English for those subtitles. And although she speaks a number of languages, she obviously doesn't speak 48, and so we get Google Translate to do much of the legwork for that. But of course Google Translate is actually quite good at translating individual words, but not so much the nuance of a whole sentence. So apologies for that. I'm sure over time it will get a bit better. Now, to actually see your subtitles in the first place, just click on the CC icon, and then if you want to change the language that you see the subtitles in, then you can click on the settings, which is next to that. Now, I've got a question here from Frankie Pitt. Be glad when that Mini is done and out of the way. Well, you know what? No more than myself. Lily, this was supposed to be just a nice, quick, simple 2-day job just to quickly throw the suspension onto Neil's Mini, and it's just expanded and expanded and expanded. And that's obviously what happens in a workshop. So it's just one of the things. So obviously, I'll try and keep Mini chat down to bare minimum. But I do have one more question here from Graham Lake. I've always wondered, when watching you do geometry setups, if you should in fact drive the car to settle it before measuring it. Well, it's a very good question. You absolutely should, because you need to make sure that the suspension is kind of relaxed position before you start doing any of those measurements. But that's exactly why we have these special plates that go underneath the tyres. So obviously when the car drops down, you can see the wheels move as the suspension kind of just finds its nice sort of base position. And then actually that's why they're there. So you don't have to drive it around before lifting it back onto the ramp to do all those adjustments. But that is what those plates are for. Now, I've got just one more question about the Mini, but I will keep this Mini stuff down to absolute minimum, obviously, but I can answer this one around the back of the car. So this question is from Clive Williams. It says, does the spherical bearing have a grease point? Obviously, he's worried about the fact that because it lives inside the wheel arch, pretty much where all that road spray, the mud, the grit, dog eggs, road apples, all that kind of stuff is just going to be all over this. It might actually contaminate and sort of damage the bearings. But also, he said, as it sort of adds at the end, at least it ought to have some kind of rubber dust cover on each side. Well, interestingly, first of all, obviously our spherical bearing here actually lives kind of almost actually just past the inner wing lining there. So it's actually quite well protected from all of that stuff being flung off the wheels, but also just the very design of a spherical bearing keeps it nice and clean. So you imagine you've got your steel ball, first of all, and then you've got the kind of the socket in there, and in between those two bits of metal is a liner. Normally it's kind of Teflon, nylon, PTFE, some kind of friction reducing material, but the tolerances are so good that actually it kind of keeps any dirt and grit out of that bearing surface. Now obviously over time, especially when you're rallying the car, you're going to sort of knock it and bump it, and perhaps eventually you get these small sort of flats forming on those surfaces, and that's when the grit could get in, and that's when eventually that bearing will degrade. But it should give you some many years of good service if you kind of look after them. Now when it comes to the question of whether this should have a grease point or grease nipple, well actually you could argue that adding grease could be detrimental, because of course then dirt and grit would be attracted to that grease, just making it even more likely to get inside that spherical bearing. So they're normally left dry, and that way they're going to stay cleaner for longer. Interestingly, when it came to the control arms, Neil did actually go for the rubber boot protective option when it came to those spherical rod ends. And so this way it just prolongs the life of those parts, because of course they're going to be more protected from the elements. Right, we've got just one more Mini question. Actually, it's more of a comment really from Keith Walker. Ed, getting a bit fed up with this Mini, back to the Range Rover please. Fair enough, I should get back to the Range Rover. But before I go, do remember to click subscribe if you haven't already, but also remember to ring that bell. Okay. Right, well, it's been a while, and now It's pretty much empty. I'm going to pop the sump plug back in, but not before you can tell. Actually, a little bit of metal on there as well. The magnet on the top is doing its job and dragging any swarf away. So clearly, at some point, we are going to have a look at the gearbox in a serious manner. But at least for now, I'm not going to get dripped on. We've got rid of the nasty stuff. So now, I've just got to quickly drop out this cross member, and then I can start undoing the sump itself. Right, there are 4 bolts holding this cross member in position on both sides. Actually, they are coming apart slightly more easily than I was imagining, so that's good. Right, this one's a bit more tricky to get to, so just pop that on there. There's been a little bit of strengthening has been put in just here, and that's just getting in the way of the ratchet, but we've got some traction. It's coming apart. Right, so now it is time to gently coax this member away from the chassis. Now, it's obviously everything's undone and it's still kind of levitating, so we'll give it a bit of a tap. I'm hoping, possibly in vain, but it'll just pop out. So as I suspected, at the moment the chassis is just kind of pinching it into position. So I'm just going to keep coaxing it. I'm going to try and pull down. What I might even do is get a ratchet strap, stand on that to sort of keep applying sort of a force down while tapping it. So just see how far I get. Nope. Okay. Right, so I'm just going to pop this down here like so, connect it like that, make sure I've got a loop that just gives me just enough room. Get my foot in there, pop it on there like so, and then, okay, so let's give this a go. So, that's much better, you see. It's edging down. Oh, it is out. So now I can get to the sump. Right, so with the cross member out of the way, I can now start to remove things to get our sump out of the way, to get to the filter which I want to change. Now the first thing is this big nut here, and that's obviously for the filler pipe and where the little dipstick goes. Okay, there we go. So a little bit of fluid may come out of here, so got my little bowl there. Actually, we're good, which is excellent. Just pop that down on the floor. So now the next thing is I can start going around all the bolts that actually hold the pan to the bottom of the gearbox. Now there are only 6 bolts holding this oil pan in place, and I'm hoping once they're undone I'll be able to sort of wiggle it past the exhaust. I don't want to have to keep taking things off this car just to get it to the MOT station. It's nuts. Oh, okay, so this is the last one. Oh, it's always the last little bit. Okay, so that is the last one. Let's see if I can wiggle this out. Oh, it's going to be tight, you know. It's going to be tight. Now the exhaust is already quite well damaged, so I might just try and prise it down just a little bit to release the sump, but I think, oh no, maybe. Oh, there we go. Oh, that really is the worst condition transmission fluid I think I've ever seen. Well worth changing. Right now, so we've got to our transmission oil filter, which is this square thing just here. It's only held on with 3 little screws, but unfortunately somebody's been here before and they've absolutely mashed them. So they are a Torx sort of socket, or at least they used to be. So the problem we have here is our sort of methods or opportunity to get these off are going to be quite limited. So first of all, I'll just try with the right Torx bit, and I'm going to give it a bit of a tap just to try and get it in past any mangled material. Oh no, see, that's just not even. I'll try another one. So the issue we have is if we try and cut these or grind them or whatever, then of course we can end up with really unpleasant swarf flying around the gearbox potentially, and that'd be very bad. Oh, so we've done one. That is good. Of course it was the easiest one to get to as well, so that's going to be interesting. So there we go, so there's that. Now, let's try the middle one. You can see this one sort of holds where the pickup pipe is. Oh no, that's definitely spinning already. So I think the next thing to try and do, I just use some mole grips perhaps. It's a little bit, you know, a little bit cowboy, but I'll give it a go. So we'll grab hold of that and try and twist it at the same time. Maybe it'll come loose. Now, first thing, just popping the Torx bit into position, then get the old moles on there. It's not ideal, but needs must. And get it on as tight as I can. Right, so now, also a little magic bit of impact driving at the same time on its lowest setting. Oh, let's see what happens. No, no, and no. Just try one more with this. No, it's not liking it at all. So the thing is, after this, we're either going to have to try a bit of heat, or even something more drastic than that. No, it doesn't look like this is going to come. Now, the problem I have is that if we were to grind a slot in the remaining 2 screw heads, then that would at least kind of give me some purchase perhaps for a bigger screwdriver bit or even an impact driver, but the problem is then all that grit could very easily fly around and get stuck to the gearbox. Now I could obviously maybe use a bit of cardboard perhaps to kind of cover the area just to try and make that a bit easier. And if I'm doing that, I could equally maybe get the old MIG welder out and actually weld another bolt onto the end of these nuts, and hopefully then that heat will penetrate through into the gearbox, freeing everything off. Oh, this really is so frustrating. But I reckon if we could just get the second screw out, then we might have a chance of using the whole of the filter to kind of rotate things round. And Dave, our cameraman, has come up with a brilliant idea, just to actually put a bit more pressure, a bit more sort of load onto the Torx bit as it's pushing into the screw to give it a bit more purchase. So the idea would be just to get a bit of metal. Got a trolley jack down here, and then also let's put in our socket like so, and then I'm just going to jack that up and effectively push it. So I'm starting to lift the whole car here, but right, so now, oh my word, look at that. He's only gone and done it. A round of applause for Dave. That is fantastic. So I'll just put that back over there. Now the great news about this is now I've got the second bolt out, what we might be able to do is actually kind of peel down the filter, because I've got the new filter here and you can just see there's like a little lip on this edge. Everything else is pretty much flat. So if I just pull this down, I'm kind of hoping, oh, there we go. Oh, so now I can actually rotate the whole of the filter around that sort of central point, and that's going to mean that that head is going to be moved within the thread, and of course that's also going to hopefully relieve things. So I might need a bit more pressure again. Right, so just going to pop in our Torx bit again, bring in the pole, add the pressure. So, okay, now I've got a lot of movement here. It's just got to be enough. I've got to try and pull that round at the same time as putting the socket. Oh, I think. Oh yes, look at that. Absolutely amazing. And that is really such a relief, because if this hadn't worked, I was then thinking about whether I'm filing some flats on the side, maybe grinding a slot in each of the heads. And of course all that means there's lots of grit flying around. Thankfully, we've had to manage to do this without compromising the gearbox in any way, which is quite wonderful. It's still really sticky though. And we're going to need some new bolts. Oh, that is fantastic. So, our filter is now finally free. So now with that out of the way, the last thing we have to do before I can stop everything back together again is to drain the fluid from the torque converter. Now inside the bell housing is our torque converter. It's basically a big metal donut, and inside it are sort of 2 half cups full of little fins. And what connects them is a load of liquid, this transmission fluid. And the idea is that the engine is spins one of these discs, if you like, with all these vanes, and those vanes then slosh the fluid around, and that then drags the other impeller around, and that's what's actually powering the gearbox and eventually giving you drive. And that's what allows you, in fact, in an automatic transmission car, to sit at the traffic lights with your foot on the brake but still be in drive. And as soon as you then take your foot off the brake, you can feel that drag starting to pull the car along, and as you accelerate, obviously this disc is actually sort of spinning faster and faster, the fluid sloshing around faster and faster and dragging the other impeller around. Now the thing is, it's full of this liquid, and of course we know the liquid is bad, so I need to drain it out. They very handily give me a little tiny observation hole, if you like. I can undo those 3 bolts, hopefully that plate will come out, and then in somewhere in there I'm going to have to spin the torque converter around. There should be another drain plug, but inside on this spinning thing. And then if I can get to that, undo it and drain it all out, then at least then we know that most of this horrible liquid is gone, and we put in the new stuff, it's going to get pretty much everywhere. It'd probably be worth flushing it out at a later date, but just for now, just to get as much of the bad stuff out as possible would be no bad thing. Aha. That's not what I was expecting. Ooh, there we go. Ugh. Wow. So, got like a biscuit of unpleasantness. So, that plug of dirt shows just how long ago this car was last looked at. Let's see what's inside. Right, so I've now put this big socket on the crank, and with a torch I can actually see the torque converter inside. So if I just kind of crank over the engine very slowly, I can see the torque converter spinning around inside, and I'm looking for a drain plug. Now it's possible, this is early enough that it doesn't even have a drain plug, but if it does, I'd love to get that nasty fluid out. Right, there are 3 lobes on the torque converter, and that's how it's attached to the flex plate, which is what an automatic car has instead of a flywheel. So it's literally a plate that flexes with a ring gear on the outside so you can actually start the vehicle. So it's kind of easy to know. I think that's number 2. Looks like maybe number 3. So there isn't, it seems, a drain plug on here, which is kind of good and bad news. Basically, it'd be really lovely to get all that horrible old fluid out of here, but clearly that's not going to happen. And I guess it just means that when we put all the new fluid back in, it's just going to have to mix up, and as long as we're 90% there, at least we'll be 90% better than we were before we started this process. And I guess it means that a bit later down the line, we'll come and flush it all again, or perhaps, if I really needed to, we can actually take the engine off, then get to the torque converter, then drain it out and start again. But I suspect we're going to need to do some more work on the gearbox further down the line, so it's no bad thing. So there we are. I've sort of saved myself a job in a weird way, but it's because we don't have the drain plug. So I'll put everything back together again, and now we can start putting the new filter back in place and then start putting everything back in and then get some fluid in. Right, so this is our new oil filter. It's quite a simple affair, really. Now the first thing I need to do is just take off that pickup pipe from the old one, pop it over to the new one. It's very simple. Again, it just twists off. It says, there we go. And it's all fine. And then as you can see, there's a little O-ring just inside there. So we've got one of those there. And I've got a little bit of oil just to wet that nicely. And then make sure that it's going to seal okay. Because after all, you need the fluid whizzing around the gearbox without any issues. So you want a nice seal on all the bits that are going to be sucking and blowing it about that gearbox. Right, so that's into position now. Tiny bit more transmission fluid just to be absolutely sure. And I can pop that into place. And then I've got a little spacer, mustn't forget. Pop that over there, like so. Now the only other thing I need to do is, you notice on this side, where it's all rather manky, where that connector goes into the gearbox itself, into the valve body, there's another O-ring right there. So again, I'm just going to give that a little bit of fluid all the way around. Just gives it a better chance of sealing. We'll just pop that on there, like so. So now that should seal nicely when it goes back into the gearbox. Also got some new bolts, so ready to go. So that is now the oil filter in place. So now I need the sump, and we're on the way. We're making some progress at last. Now I just need to do a little bit of cleaning on this sump. I thought I'd just drain out the last of the oil and see what's underneath. It's not looking good. It looks a little bit like chocolate sauce, which I don't think is supposed to be used in an automatic transmission. Now I fear that's the remains of all the paper clutches that will be inside there, so they've probably been dissolved by the water and the contamination. So this fix might not work, but it's always worth a try. Right, so I've just given our little sump a bit of a clean. Now it needs a brand new gasket, so I'm just going to pop this in place. Almost certainly going to happen is it's going to be knocked off again as I try and fettle it into position, but might as well start as we go on. So now it's going to pop up here. It was a bit of a battle to get off, but we'll see. Let's just try and get this into position in a cunning way. So, oh look at that. Nearly, and there we are. Now they're actually quite clever little clamps. You can see a sort of unequal length on either side of the screw. So the short side goes actually onto the pan, the long side goes onto the gearbox itself, and that way it stops the seal getting too crushed. Obviously you've still got to torque it up correctly, but still it's quite a smart idea. Right, at least now all the threads have just been a little bit started, so I can now just go around very slowly doing up with the ratchet. But I'll just do a few turns on each just to get them into the right position. And just be mindful all the time that the seal is going to end up in the right position. Actually, the clean metal on the gearbox is helping me with that. So last thing to go back on here is the dipstick tube. This nice big nut here, and then once this is done up, we can go onto the top side and fill up the gearbox with some new transmission fluid. And then I guess the question will be, has this actually worked? Was all this effort worthwhile? Wonderful. Now before I put the cross member back in, I thought I'd just give the chassis rails on either side a bit of a clean, just to get rid of the worst of that mud, because I think it's going to be a bit of a struggle. Right, that's clean enough, not quite concourse, but it'll do. So right now I'm just going to pop a little bit of grease just over this, just to help this membrane. As I say, what I'm worried about is that either side of the chassis are going to be coming inwards slightly, and that's going to sort of pinch the cross member and stop it from going in. And I have another trick up my sleeve just in case it's still a bit of a struggle. Okay, here goes. Found another secret stash of John's vintage filth. You know, I mean, I hope we could go on for a long time with that. Right, so it's now time for our cross member to go back in. Obviously, it is very gnarly. Could do with a lot of work, but I just want to get this in so we can get the car started again, drive it to the MOT, and find out what else it's going to fail on. Get a bolt anywhere near in. It's not far off. There we go, one in. There we go. So we've now got 2 bolts in position. So at least I can now start tightening things up. I'm just using a screwdriver to make sure I can get my bolt through my hole. I think you can see this has had a bit of manipulation over the years as John's stoved it into rocks, presumably. And I guess ultimately it holds the chassis together a bit and protects the transmission. Now I'm pretty sure this isn't going to be the last time that I remove and put back this cross member, but I'll sort them up nice and tight. Now with the cross member securely back in position, the last thing we have to do before I can lower the car and put in the transmission fluid is pop in a brand new washer for the drain plug to make sure it doesn't leak. Lovely. Right, so we are getting quite close now. So, time for some fluid, 8.52 litres capacity, but bear in mind there is some still in the torque converter. And also I need to be checking the levels once the engine is running, and I've sloshed it through all the gears a few times as well. So I'm just going to put about 7 litres or so in first of all, then I'll start her up, then we'll start the rest of that process. But we'll then be able to find out whether this quick fix, which has taken forever, has actually worked. Right, well that's really exciting. The wheels are turning in all of the gears and it's a much smoother transition, so it could be that this quick fix is actually going to be good enough to get us to the MOT station. Just going to check the fluid. Right, okay, it's just a little bit over maximum, but that's okay because actually it's running a bit hotter than you normally test the fluid at, so that's okay. So if it's going to get us to the MOT station, the next thing we need to worry about is actually stopping rather than hitting the MOT station. And for that, I'm going to have to fix those leaky brakes. And that is a job for another day.